Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nidhi Baiswar, Sustainability and Climate Leadership Director at JLL. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues, Paul Stepan, EMEA Head of Client Sustainability Solutions, and Phoebe Lewis, Associate Director at our Sustainability Consultancy team, to talk more about the green building principles and the action plan for net zero carbon buildings. You've probably heard that real estate accounts for almost 40% of carbon emissions. What's more, most of the existing stock we have today will be around in 2050, a year synonymous with many net zero carbon targets. Decarbonizing real estate is therefore critical, but it's a complex task and it won't happen overnight. That's why all companies that own or lease real estate have to start taking action as soon as possible. To help, JLL created the Green Building Principles in partnership with the World Economic Forum. These provide a roadmap for companies to reach out their net zero targets across their real estate portfolio with a clear action plan. The principles also complement and explain how companies can align against existing initiatives, for example, the guidance set by the World Green Building Council on the net zero carbon buildings commitments. So let's start at the beginning. The first step for any net zero carbon strategy is calculating your carbon footprints, so you can understand where you are to identify your baseline and then set realistic targets. Also, with terminology around carbon like scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, operational, embodied and whole life carbon emissions, it's an area we know our clients struggle with. So Paul, tell us about some of the greatest pain points that our clients face in terms of collecting data and measuring carbon.
Thanks, Nidhi. This data issue is a real challenge. When you look at it, it's not just data around the emissions, it's also around the technology, its cost and performance, and also what's the value that's going to be created from these pathways as well. And so what we find typically with our clients is that sometimes even just for the carbon emissions, they're estimating 80% of their baseline at the beginning, picking up on things like tenant operations and also embodied carbon. But the point is you can't stop there because we have to focus on action. So actually what we do is we work iteratively in parallel. We're on the data, but also on what are the key decisions that you need to make. I think the second bit that then comes from that is how do you then turn that into a business decision? So how do you then turn what all this data tells you into something that resonates with leadership? Because what we find is if you're not able to embed it, say, in asset value, then actually down the road when you're looking to implement, that then becomes a real challenge.
That's great, that's good to know. So Phoebe, how can companies best approach data collection?
So I think the first step with data collection is very much to not let perfection be the enemy of the good. And so when we work with companies, what we want to make sure is for your asset information, for your energy information, do you have enough to create a robust baseline and then supplement it with benchmarks for data estimation? So very much speaking to what Paul had said. And then beyond that, you really want to, so you have a starting block with that. The next step is to then plug those gaps. And one of the main ones really is that tenant engagement piece. So can you work with your tenants to identify those opportunities? And a lot of it is perhaps sub-metering the data, but then there are other co-benefits that you can share with the tenant as a result of that as well.
So Phoebe, what we are really saying is that clients need to act fast and record their data from wherever possible sources they can to begin with.
Absolutely. So it's get going as soon as you can, identify where your gaps are, but don't let that be an impediment to starting with some of the actions that you can do, some of the quick wins in the short run.
That's very useful to know. Thank you. Let's move on to embodied carbon, the big elephant in the room. It accounts for nearly half of the entire carbon footprint in the lifespan of a building. The most substantial portion of these embodied carbon emissions occur prior to the building becoming occupied and operational. It is a big issue that companies are tackling in new developments and major refurbishments. So Paul, talk us through how clients are looking at embodied carbon and how much progress has been made in this area.
So I think it's moving very fast. But I think at the same time, it's recognized as an area where people are struggling with scalable solutions at the moment. So I mean, the biggest question always with embodied carbon right now is, do you build at all? And what are those design choices you make up front? And then when you do decide that you need to do this, is what are the right metrics to monitor? And right now there's still a conversation about what's the right carbon metrics that you use for those phases of the building cycle, what standards do you use? And then following that, how do you embed that in the supply chain? And how do you practically achieve this beyond using some fairly generic assumptions and actually really look at what is the impact you're having in the supply chain? I think one of the things it's not helped by is that unlike in operational carbon, where you've had quite a lot of ground made on both regulation and voluntary standards, in embodied carbon it's still quite early and quite local. So what do you scale off?
That's good. So basically we are looking at a market that is not mature enough. Is that the situation, or?
It's interesting because it's such a big part of the carbon story, but actually at this point in time it's still hard to point to the right metrics that one would use. And in a way it comes back to that first question, should you build at all? Once you've answered that, then you've got to find the right metrics to embed.
Thank you. So Phoebe, how can companies best approach embodied carbon?
I think that the approach to embodied carbon needs to be twofold. So it very much depends on your particular company structure, but generally what we advise clients to do is to just zoom out and get that big picture. In terms of where they are now and where they want to go to towards their target year, where are their embodied carbon emissions going to come from? Once they've got that general sense, then it makes sense to prioritize particular assets and intervene at the design stage. One of the challenges that we have is a lot of clients would look to try and reduce embodied carbon on a project that's already partway through. So the main thing is intervene in the design stage and then measure the carbon throughout that process. So at design, at procurement, at practical completion, and then you can identify the materials and the design processes to reduce that emission. And then also to make sure that you're looking at the difference between what it was in the initial design and what it is now as you reduce it along that process.
So the planning has to start very early on into the design stage.
100%. It's planning, it's measuring throughout, and then it's seeking out those innovative solutions, most of which are circular economy principles. So you're looking at flexible designs, design for disassembly, selection of low carbon materials, local sourcing of materials as well. There's so many options there.
And one of the things that we really saw with a client who really did this very successfully was they really embedded it across the whole project team on day one. They made it a priority, and that meant that actually very organically through the design you found there's a lot of innovation and alignment between all the teams.
Operational energy is the other side of the coin. Reducing the amount of energy buildings consume is central to a net zero future. The good news is that we already have the solutions and technology we need. The bad news is the process of optimizing energy consumption can be expensive. So Paul, how are companies taking steps to reduce their operational energy, and does this fit into their business plans?
The answer to that is yes, and actually it's a very mature part of the market, and there's some great solutions here that you can reach in any single geography, right? And actually what we know is typically for most assets you can optimize them by around about 20% in terms of energy consumption with very quick, low-cost measures, right? We use a platform called HANK that really allows us to analyze the building management systems and then create workflows from that. And the types of things you're improving there is systems fighting one another, like heating and cooling fighting each other, or optimizing the on-off times for systems like lighting, for instance, as well. So data is a big part of the challenge there, and accessing that data and coding it, and you've got a huge amount of technology that can resolve that. But then on the other side of it as well is thinking not just when you have the data itself and looking at it, but what's the workflow that follows. So who does what that follows up from that? And I think what you touched on earlier around the processes is key. Connect the data to processes and you very quickly have a high performing building.
What are the other benefits?
Yeah, it's a really good point, because actually what we often find is that these spaces aren't just more energy efficient, they're just more pleasant spaces to be in. They tend to have higher air quality, they tend to be more comfortable for the users, and they benefit therefore from having fewer complaints as well. So these optimized spaces are more resilient and more desirable for a lot of these occupiers, as well as being more energy efficient.
So that then fills into the business plan model for clients and corporates when they're looking at talent retention and other areas linked to that.
That's right, and actually it goes more than that, because it's also about the productivity of the people who use these buildings. And what you find is there's a relationship between the air quality and the productivity, and all of this has to go hand in hand with optimizing the building systems.
Thank you for that. Another key part of decarbonisation journey is sourcing and using renewable energy. Companies often spend a lot of time looking at transitioning their energy to renewable or clean energy option. It's very much a growth area, and we are seeing more renewable energy projects and solutions become available. Some of them are increasingly innovative. For example, smart floor tiles harnessing energy from movement to power lights in buildings. Paul, how is the client appetite when it comes to renewable energy sourcing and procurement?
Yeah, it's very high, right? Because actually you look at this and you feel that this is a silver bullet, a scalable solution for one significant area for my emissions. And therefore it's very attractive from that perspective. And actually when you look at the prices of some of these renewable solutions, they're actually very competitive compared to the market, and they sometimes give you price certainty. So overall there's a real case to look at this very closely. One of the interesting challenges around renewable purchasing is how you guarantee the provenance and the additionality of what you're buying. And it's often in the weeds there that makes all the difference between what is high quality and low quality, and I think Phoebe might expand on that. Mm-hmm. But I think the other side of it as well is that at the moment, renewable energy purchasing outside of some markets, some schemes, does not have regulatory weight. So until it really does, it's difficult for clients to rely solely on that as being a key solution to decarbonise, and actually it's just part of a wider narrative. But the demand in principle is high.
That's good to know. So overall, in terms of any client's decarbonisation journey, renewable energy is a part of their solution, and they are trying to apply it either on an asset level or on their portfolio level.
Yes, that's right. I mean, sometimes what you find with clients is it's part of almost a multi-dimensional approach where they really try to reduce demand, and then after that source off-site renewables. And then in that scenario, sometimes they have to collaborate with others to improve their purchasing power. And indeed, sometimes what you have is some of the major customers actually offering their purchasing power back out into their supply chain, which is really innovative.
Thanks, Paul. So Phoebe, from that perspective now, looking at renewable energy, what would you like to add?
I think that there are a few points that Paul's made which I'd like to elaborate on, which is that so when we look at it from the green building principle perspective, the first thing to do is to try and maximize your on-site renewables to the extent possible. But even if you do that, you're still going to have likely quite a high energy demand that you need to meet. And so it's very much in that high quality procurement piece, and that where what Paul was saying about additionality is so important. Is the renewable energy that you're purchasing adding new renewable capacity to the grid rather than just procuring what might already be there? Because the purpose is to make sure that an increasing proportion of our grids, irrespective of which country you're in, an increasing proportion of that energy comes from renewable, not fossil fuel based energy, right? And so it's really about trying to procure that high quality. One of the challenges is that there isn't necessarily enough demand from an individual company to get, for instance, a power purchase agreement or something that might be more high quality. So what we need to think about as an industry is what are the innovative mechanisms we have to create sufficient demand for high quality. And then another nuance within that is the importance that sits alongside renewable energy procurement of electrifying the grid so that you're able to get that energy to your buildings when you need to. And the challenge then comes in as well is that that's going to be quite different from country to country. And that's where you need to really make sure you have that on-site and then also off-site sitting together.
So in a way, the real estate industry can actually push the market and increase the renewable energy production for every country.
Absolutely. So it's just one of the things that we like to encourage clients to look at is not only how you can influence your own buildings and your own company, your portfolio, but how can you actually influence the infrastructure of the cities that you work in, the countries that you live in, because that's what's going to drive the change, that very systematic thinking.
Thank you. Offsetting is a term we've come to hear a lot in the recent times, especially in relation to corporate efforts to decarbonize. Companies undoubtedly will need to use offsets to reach net zero, but they should only be used as a final step. Phoebe, what does good offsetting look like?
So the market for offsetting has advanced rapidly in the past 2 years, and it's largely in response to what the Oxford University put out in terms of their Oxford offsetting principles, which basically said, if we want to use offsets as part of net zero carbon, what does high quality look like? There are a few elements to it, but the main ones are that they need to be transparent, that you need to make sure that there are no negative unintended consequences, and also that you are ensuring that we are shifting from an emissions reductions offsets to carbon removal. And what that effectively means is that right now the offsets that are available are ones that prevent new emissions from going into the atmosphere. But because even if we stopped polluting now, there would still be so many emissions in the atmosphere, we need to take them out. We need to move towards emission carbon removal offsets. So at its simplest level, reforestation, afforestation, but there are some more high-tech versions as well. So that's the kind of offset that you need to look at. But in terms of what's relevant for our clients, we need to think about when do we position this in our strategy. And so it's about identifying the types of offsets, the quantity that you'll likely need to offset, and when you really need to start thinking about it given when your target years are.
That's good. And ideally, if it looks into, or if it is aligned with your business model and what your company really delivers, that would be a good situation to be in.
Absolutely. Are you able to look at offsets that contribute towards the built environment, towards infrastructure? If not, that's fine, but thinking about those strategic alignments is important.
Thank you. One of the key messages in the principles is the need to engage with stakeholders across the value chains to reduce carbon emissions. It's easier said than done, whether embedding net zero goals in lease agreements, ensuring good communication between landlords and tenants, or ensuring strong leadership. Phoebe, talk us through how and why engaging with stakeholders is so important.
So I would say that identifying your stakeholders and engaging with them is one of the most important things that you can do, simply because net zero carbon, it doesn't matter who's necessarily paying for the particular action so long as you get to net zero carbon. So if you're a landlord and you can engage with your tenants to share costs that benefit both of you, so much the better. We're all working towards this goal and we need to work towards it as quickly as possible because time is truly running out. And so that's why stakeholder engagement is essential, because we don't have the answers to this puzzle on our own. So the key thing to do is to engage with your tenants if you're a landlord, and vice versa, landlord to tenant. But there are other networks that are very important to cultivate as well.
Thank you. And Paul, in your experience, do you have any good examples to share from your clients?
It's another one of those big questions of the day right now, which is actually where can you find the scalable synergy across different asset classes between the landlords and the occupiers? And it's going to be a really important part of a zero carbon transition, because actually it's a huge part of the emissions on the landlord side. And it's a real challenge for the occupiers to get right if they don't own the buildings. And what we see overall actually is that now increasingly a number of our clients are developing not just green lease terms that they use at one point in the transaction, they're actually embedding green leases and that conversation across their leasing conversation with the landlord and tenant. And then they're also increasingly building playbooks. And those playbooks might touch on all elements of a property model and be quite creative in how you achieve these zero carbon outcomes in quite a collaborative and synergistic way. You know, we've got a great example in JLL actually, where we've recently let our headquarters, One Broadgate, with British Land. And we've got a great collaboration with them on actually what are the performance obligations that we'll commit to and try to achieve, and what are the expectations we can have from the landlord, and indeed what are those expectations that other tenants will also contribute to that. And I think it's in that accountability and in the measurement of those key KPIs that makes all the difference, right, on that building.
That's really good. Actually, there are very few examples of tenant and landlord collaboration in the market. This should form a good case study for the market to learn from.
Yeah, it was really interesting, and I think maybe one of the key success factors we took away from it was it's about having the right people in the room early on who are willing to drive that collaboration. And in this case, it was the heads of sustainability on both sides who helped frame the conversation, maybe similar to how we bring HR into the conversation on fit out and around talent retention in a way that we didn't historically when selecting a site.
Thank you. One thing's really clear, it's that we have to work together to make net zero a reality, and we have to act now. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Phoebe, for all the information you've shared today. It's fascinating to hear how companies are stepping up to the challenges of decarbonising real estate. It's something that we at JLL are also tackling across our own portfolio as we advise our clients on theirs. To explain more about this journey, I'll now hand over to our colleague, Cynthia Curtis. Cynthia, over to you.
Thanks, Nidhi. What a great recap of the green building principles. Of course, it's familiar to us because we have followed that similar path in our own journey at JLL. Certainly twists and turns along the way, and we're by no means done, but we've made some good progress, good solid progress. And so we're really excited actually about our net zero goal and what that is going to mean for our business and for our clients. So we agreed to up our game to a science-based net zero carbon target by 2040 across all three scopes. So in the earlier one, we had a different target, an absolute target for scopes 1 and 2, and then an intensity target for scope 3, which still very challenging, was a little bit easier. This latest target, our now target through 2040, is net zero across our scopes 1, 2, and 3, with no more than 5% offsets. It's daunting and exhilarating at the same time. Like most, our scope 3 is material based on the fact that it is outsized in percentage of our overall emissions. And within that scope 3, our client emissions account for over 96%. So that's the spaces that we manage on behalf of clients, the facilities that we manage on behalf of clients. So, and Nidhi mentioned this in her closing remarks. It is critical, therefore, that we collaborate, that we work together, that we take a systems view, because that's the only way we're all going to reach our targets. So clearly, this is a big target for us, and it has the result from an internal standpoint is increased investment in our own prop tech, increased investment in upskilling of our people, increased investment in training so that people across our company, regardless of function, see a way to help support within their job, help support our ambitious net zero target, and investments in our approach and tools and technologies that we can bring to our clients and to our suppliers. No one can do it on their own, and so it absolutely requires collaboration, communication, engagement, stubbing your toe, leveraging best practices. So our approach is we embed sustainability across our business. We use ourselves essentially as a guinea pig. We take all of the lessons that we learn from our own work with our own aggressive target. We take those learnings and best practices to our clients. We learn from the work that we do with our clients. We bring that back in-house, and that informs, what it is again that we do. So it's really a virtuous circle of best practice and continuous improvement, and we need all of that. We all need all of that in order for us to do what it is that we need to do, to have the impact that we must have, and to reach, a net zero world. So thank you so much. And I'm excited about the 24-hour World GBC initiative. And we at JLL are just thrilled to be part of it.